All right, so we've talked a bit then about Southern agriculture. And I want to shift gears here and move on to Southern industrialization. And I'd like to start by talking about one of the major figures behind this process of Southern industrialization, a gentleman by the name of Henry Grady. Grady is very well known as a Southern booster. And that term booster really just means promoter. He was a promoter of the South and a particular vision of the South. Grady was a newspaper man, editor for the Atlanta Constitution. And so he knew how to use a pen, he knew how to write, he knew how to project a message and get a point across. And there's a story told about Grady of how in the 1880s he traveled north to the city of Boston. And while in Boston, he spoke to an elite social club made up largely of those so-called Boston Brahmins, old families, wealthy families. And in a speech that he gave to them, he tells the story of an old Southern one-gallust fella. And what that basically means is a Southerner who's so poor they can't afford the straps to keep their pants up, so they only have one gallus. What do we normally call those? Suspenders. Well, he's only got one strap of suspender. And Grady tells of how this gentleman dies, and in dying is to be buried. And Grady relates that when the gentleman was buried, he was buried in a shirt that maybe came from Cincinnati, and the nails in the coffin had come from Pittsburgh in Pennsylvania. How so much of what went into that funeral, what the gentleman wore, what provided for everyday needs, came from outside the South. But before he's done, Grady tells the audience there that things have changed in the South. That anymore, he says, instead of having to go outside the South or outside the local area, there are factories now at work. There are people producing items in the South, supplying the South's markets and the South's needs. He says things have essentially changed. We have textile mills, we have iron mills, we have steel, we have furniture, timber operations. He concludes his speech, Grady does, by saying to these gentlemen that the South is coming after them. And what he means by that, and it actually says that the South is coming after them to take a revenge. And he means revenge for the Civil War. But what he's really saying there is that the South before the Civil War was a different South than what exists after the war. Now, we talked about some of this with Southern agriculture and how agriculture and thus rural society was transformed by the outcomes, the repercussions of war, sharecropping, etc. But what Grady's talking about here is he's talking about a South that has decided to take the path of what we might call progress or modernization that's been followed by the northern states that turned out to be victorious on the battlefield during the Civil War. He says, in fact, that the South is coming to meet the North, that the South is catching up, whereas it didn't have factories before, now it does. It's producing, it's building those factories, and its society is being transformed in the same ways Northern society was transformed in places like Lowell, Massachusetts, and Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. That, for Henry Grady, this great promoter of the concept of the New South, that is the New South. But it's a little more complicated than that. Because, as I suggested, bound into Henry Grady's New South are ties that linger to notions of the Old South. When Grady says that this new South is coming to meet these Boston Brahmins, what he's actually saying is, or what he's embodying in his talk, is an understanding that we have entered in the South on this pathway of progress, following the model set by others that seem to be so successful in very real, concrete ways. But in pursuing that path, what we're actually doing in many ways is reviving the South itself. A South which acts as counterpoint to the rest of the nation. A South which has known defeat, but though it was defeated on the battlefield, Grady might suggest, the very causes for which the South fought weren't lost. You see, what emerges after the Civil War in the southern United States is often referred to as the lost cause mythology. And it's fascinating to me how this lost cause mythology operates. It elevates to almost divine status some of the figures who were responsible for secession and responsible ultimately for the outcome of the war. Figures like Robert E. Lee, who was among the most important of the almost deified figures of this lost cause mythology. And behind it all is that notion that while the South may have lost in material terms, may have lost on the battlefield, that the South had not lost the moral question, had not lost the moral argument. Maybe that's a better way to put it. That the South and the Civil War, in fact, Southerners of the New South might have argued, was never about the mundane questions of life, but instead was about questions of virtue and questions of culture, for which the South hadn't been wrong at all. And that's the great dilemma or conundrum there. It's the great opposition of the New South idea and the mythology of the lost cause. On the one hand, we're following a new path toward modernity. But that very path is connected fundamentally with the ability of the South to look backward toward the old and remake it, to pull victory from the jaws of defeat, so to speak, even if it's a moral victory as opposed to a victory on the field. Well, anyhow, I think that's something that you might want to think about is how this idea of the New South in this very complicated way binds together the new and the old simultaneously. But it's investment that our old friend Henry Grady is after. And what we'll see develop across the South will be the introduction of new industries, but also the great development of traditional industries that had existed even in the antebellum or pre-war South. In terms of Southern industry, then, there were new industries that were introduced to the South and came in ever larger numbers, but many of the Southern industries of the New South of the late 19th century were already extant in some form or at some level, even prior to the Civil War. One of the aspects, though, of the New South that historians of the past in particular have talked about had to do with a sort of economic colonialism. You may recall the destruction that the South experienced during the Civil War. The capital necessary for rebuilding the South and building new factories or new processing facilities, that capital's got to come from somewhere. Much of it actually came from northern investors, but also from international investors. And these are the same people who ultimately will be selling or purchasing products from the South, from the southern United States. Now, the thing is, we traditionally think about an economy that draws resources or very limited production from an area and provides capital then for that production in the area, and then uses those resources to manufacture goods that can be resold into a particular region or area. We think about that in colonial terms, or certainly some historians have. And for Americans, often the way to think of colonial terms would be to think of the United States, well, not the U.S., but the colonies before the Revolutionary War. There were limits on what could be produced in the colonies back in the 1700s. Most manufacturing took place outside the colonies, and the colonists themselves were forced then to purchase manufactured goods without having the advantage of what we call value added. That is to say, the value that's added to any product by processing. So most of what was being drawn out of the colonies was fairly unprocessed resources, timber, for instance, or ores, or agricultural products. And in exchange for those, then colonists could purchase manufactured goods, but often at a loss. That is, because of the value added to the original resources they sent over, they ended up paying more for the manufactured goods. The flow of capital then was from the colonies to the mother country, or from the colonies in America to Britain. And that's the way the British policy had set that up. Well, in much the same way, some historians and economists have argued that's what we see happening with the U.S. South when we move into the late 19th century. Because there's a lack of capital, most capital comes from outside the region in terms of investment. And then, most of what's coming out of the South would be pretty unprocessed resources that are then sent to other areas like the American North, the northern United States, for manufacturing. That's where the value is added. And then those manufactured goods are sent back south where they're marketed and bought, purchased. That's what Henry Grady had been talking about in his speech when he was talking about that one Gallust fella and items that had to be brought from outside the South for that gentleman's funeral. In some ways, the economy of the South was colonial. I mean, you can look at it that way. We also nowadays think in broader terms of world systems and periphery and core and those kind of things. It is true enough that the Southern economy was largely resource-based. In other words, that a large portion of the industrial production of the South depended on the presence and access to resources that the South had and the development of those resources. And that those resources received limited processing in the South itself. But there's another side to this that's worth considering, because there are other industries that gradually move into the South and have a larger and larger proportion of industrial production in the South that aren't so much about resources or the primary processing of resources, but they come south because they are industries that benefit from one particular advantage, and that's the advantage of low labor costs. In other words, they're the types of industries where competition is so stiff, that how much one pays workers can ultimately make or break the profitability of your business. It's that close, and labor is a distinct advantage. These so-called lower wage or low skill type jobs or employment opportunities often mean that Southern industry will tend to be more decentralized than you might see industry in other portions of the country. One example would be textiles, where it was possible in the making of cloth and apparel and what we call textiles. You could locate these small factories, if they were small, throughout the region. You weren't specifically tied to a resource like coal or certain ores or anything like that. Instead, it depended on where labor costs were most advantageous as to where these textile companies might choose to locate. So we have both resource-based with limited processing coming out of the South in terms of industry, but we also have an influx of sort of low-wage, low-skill industries as well.